I'm blue, da ba dee ba da boo. Welcome back everyone, it's Robert Macfarlane here, and today we're going to be going through key things that every single director should know about cameras. Cameras are this interesting thing. Now, a lot of directors, they know a good amount about cameras. Some directors know nothing about cameras at all. They are more interested in the storytelling. But I think there are some key things that no matter who you are, no matter what type of director you are, to understand certain elements of cameras makes you a better storyteller, because ultimately the tool you are using to record what you are putting in front of it has the ability to change how we feel about what's in front of the camera.
That makes total sense.
Before I started making videos, I started out as a photographer. I took pictures of pretty much everything, and it taught me how to use a camera. But what it didn't do, it didn't tell me how to tell a story with a camera. And quite often I would do what I think is probably one of the worst sins in film, which is I would choose images and angles based on how cool the image looked and not necessarily how those settings and those choices were actually affecting the way the audience felt about my story, about the characters they were seeing on screen. It wasn't until later in my career that I started to understand how incredibly powerful each aspect of the camera was in manipulating the way the audience received your story, how they felt about your characters. Love me! It wasn't just about writing a sad story, it was about so much more than that. And the camera itself has a huge amount of power to add to your storytelling.
And I know that with great power comes great responsibility.
So first things first, depth of field. Most of you have probably heard of it, and most of you have used it, and most of you probably think that the shallower the depth of field, the more cinematic it will look. You are right in a way. The more shallow your depth of field, the more you will separate your subject, or whatever you're focused on, from its background and foreground. This helps the audience focus on what you want them to focus on. However, depth of field can be used in a multitude of ways, not just by making it as shallow as possible, but it can be used to tell story. Let's say, for instance, we have a character who's very emotional at a particular point in your film. They're on the verge of crying because of the trauma that's occurred to them. So we, as the director, as the filmmaker, decide we're going to do a close-up right on their eye so we can see into their soul. I've got three options here. I can use either an incredibly shallow depth of field, a medium depth of field, or a very deep depth of field. Do you see how each of the images makes you feel a different way about the character? By making the background and foreground more out of focus, we focus more on the character, but we also make the character feel like they are more separated from their surroundings. Maybe they are far more internal, they're thinking, they're feeling, they're not really present in the room. Whereas the shallowest depth of field might make us think about what the character might be thinking of, the medium depth of field makes us more think about what they're feeling at this point. The large depth of field, this is where we bring in the majority of the space around them into focus. We now understand that this character is more aware of the environment around them. This is especially useful for action films. This is the same shot choice, but given the context of your story, you can choose to not just create a cool looking image, but you can choose to utilize depth of field to aid you, to help you tell your story.
My word, I really must have been asleep.
For me, probably one of the most difficult areas to understand in terms of its power to tell story has always been focal length. And by this, I mean, is the shot wide or is it really close? How does that affect the look of my subject? And then how does that affect the look of my background and my foreground? What I understood very early on in my photographic career is that the longer the lens, the less of of the background that I saw in my image. The wider the lens, generally the more of the background. I mean, just like this, you are getting to see a lot of the background in the studio. Whereas in previous episodes to this YouTube channel, I've actually used a much longer lens and spoken to the camera when it's further away. Now, you see, even though I'm roughly the same size in the frame, you are seeing a lot more of what is around me. This can be used in a multitude of ways, but let's just say you've got a character running through a park. Now, we've got our three options. We've got a long lens, a medium lens, and a very wide lens. So even though it's the same action in the same space with the same acting, we get three different feelings from the different focal lengths. So with a wide shot, we feel like the character is more a part of the space that they are running through. Maybe we get a sense of how alone and separate they are from the rest of the world because there is no one else in the frame. On the medium shot, we get a slightly more personal view with a little bit less background in and foreground. It gives us more a sense of the body and the physicality of the running. This is far more effective when we're trying to show how the character is moving and why they're moving through a space, especially really useful in chase sequences and fight sequences because we want to see the body language. How are they using their body? The wide shot, we couldn't necessarily see that quite so easily. And then finally, we've got the long shot. The long shot makes us feel like the camera is much further away from the character. This also separates us from the character and makes us feel like we're almost looking in on them, like someone is watching them. This can be incredibly useful in spy movies, or if someone is being watched from a distance. There's more to the focal length than that. What if we tried to keep the size of the subject the same in the frame no matter the focal length? And by doing this, what we do is we take the camera further away the longer the lens gets. And from this, you'll be able to see just how much the surroundings change when we look at our character.
Why didn't you show me this before?
All right. For those of you who have used cameras a little bit, you already know about shutter angle. I believe better than shutter speed is what is known as shutter angle. They still both deal with how long the shutter is open for, or on digital cameras, how much time the sensor takes light in for during a single frame. Most of you probably already use the rule that whatever your frame rate, you choose twice the shutter speed, such as if you've got 24 frames per second, the cinematic standard, you would choose a shutter speed of 1/48th of a second. Now, most cameras these days actually come with the option of changing the readout to show a shutter angle rather than a shutter speed. But shutter angle is slightly different. You get 0 to 360 degrees. But how does this change how we read and think about the shutter speed of our camera? Back when film cameras were the main cinematic powerhouse, they would use shutter angle. The reason for this is that we would have a disc that would sit in front of the film, and as the new film was put in front of the lens, the disc would be spinning and it would be open for one side and closed for the other. So as it span, it would be in front of the film until it came out of the way of the film. What this meant was that camera operators and cinematographers would choose to use different discs with different amounts of the disc blocked and open, and that would create what was known as the shutter angle. If half of the disc was closed and half of the disc was open, well, that's 180 degrees. So they would have a 180 degree shutter angle. This became the cinematic standard and is still used today. However, most of you probably don't venture away from this rule, but there's some creative flexibility here. For those of you who've come from photography, you probably already know that the higher your shutter speed, the less motion blur you get. Now, that's all fair and well for photography, but how does that affect our image? Tony Scott made a brilliant movie which I thoroughly enjoyed, The Taking of Pelham 123. At the beginning of the movie, we are treated to a montage of shots of trains, railways, and cityscapes. What he's done is he's done something slightly different. Instead of just your standard shots, he's done what is termed as undercranking. and then left the shutter speed very low to let light in over a long period of time. What this does is it creates a blurry, almost dreamlike image. It's saying, I want you to get the soul of this space, but I don't want you to have to think about all the details in this space. This is more about conveying the feeling rather than information. Look at your film and start to think about the style, the choices, the characters, the journeys, the emotional state of the audience and the characters in your film. And this should enable you to choose how to set up your camera, from your depth of field, your focal length, your shutter angle, your shutter speed, and your aspect ratio for your film. Smash the like button because I know you want to, and check out some links below to help you up your game on your next film.